Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hey everyone, welcome back to Lawyers Mediators International Podcast, where we talk about law and conflict resolution topics to educate professionals and everyday people. And I have back with me Andy Semotiuk. Andy, how are you doing?
Fantastic. Glad to be with you here today.
Yes, thank you. And welcome back to the show. Of course, you are regular now, and we talk with you about immigration law and international law. Based on your experience, you provide a lot of guidance on these topics. And so it's great to have you back to help us recap the latest and what's been going on around the world, which is a lot. And so just before I begin with the questions, you are an immigration lawyer, licensed in California and New York. You work with the Pace Law Firm. That's pacelawfirm.com. And you're also licensed to practice law in Canada and Ontario and British Columbia. And so right now what's going on in Canada as we speak is the G7. President Trump's been there. All the leaders from the major industrial economies in the world have come, and there's been a little bit of a controversy has been created. And so we'll start off with that first. I'll share my screen and to point to people to your article that you just wrote on Forbes called Trump's Russia-China Pitch Upends the G7. And give me 2 seconds, and you should see my screen right about now. Okay, so can you first tell us the issue, what happened, and then get into your article and why you wrote it? Go ahead.
Okay, so all these leaders are at what's called Kananaskis, which is a beautiful, beautiful park site in Alberta in the Rocky Mountains. And President Trump came yesterday, and the discussion among the leaders, the seven leaders of the big seven democracies, centered around President Trump's comment to the effect that it's too bad that Russia and China are not included, and we should include these. And just historically, at one time, Russia was included with the G7. It was called the G8. That was in 2014. But the problem arose that Russia occupied Crimea and then attacked the Donbass. And so the G7 rejected them, saying, you have to fix this problem before we're going to let you be back in the G8. And because of the relationship Trump evidently has forged with Putin, he felt that it would be a good idea to invite those two countries into the G7 again. But the reaction was negative on the part of virtually all the leaders in the G7 for obvious reasons. Russia's in the midst of the same war that was going on then. It still continues today in more amplified form. And China's not exactly a model of human rights in the world. Many people know about the sale of body parts. Falun Gong and Uyghurs have been pretty much persecuted in China. There was a time when China was arresting dissidents, taking, I guess, basically killing them and selling body parts. You need a new kidney? We got a kidney for you. And they, as much as admitted it in, I think, 2015, one of the ministers of health there made the admission. I think they've stopped that part back then, but they still continue to be a human rights violator to this day. So it didn't make sense for either of those countries to be welcomed back into a democratic, basically, the misunderstanding was this was not about power and money. This was about human rights, democracy, rule of law. these countries are democratic countries, and they support the rules-based order. So,
Mhm.
strangely, Trump left Sunday evening, just got on the plane and went back to Washington.
Yeah, there was some controversy here about why he had left, but what was Trump's rationale as to why he wanted those two countries to be invited back or invited in for the first time in China's case?
Well, he said he argued that Russia should never have been booted out because they're a major power. I think his thinking is power with nuclear weapons and so on makes you a candidate for joining this industrialized group of nations, but he's missing the democratic side of the equation.
Mm.
He was missing that part of the ethics, morals, democracy, rule of law, human rights. He doesn't appear, or he didn't appear to get it, that the G7 was also concerned about those issues, and obviously these countries would not make it on that score.
Yes. So, what your overall thesis in the article?
Well, I said that again, for the reasons I just argued, the two countries should not be allowed. As far as America is concerned, America still remains a democracy. As far as I'm concerned, in my books, it is a democracy. And until it has a free press and courts that support the Constitution and civil rights and so on, and until colleges support democracy and open expression of opinions, etc., America as a country is still, vibrant. But unfortunately, the leadership, President Trump, is not leading in a democratic direction. He's leading in an authoritarian direction. And one point I made in the article also was, since he's such a good friend, friend of Putin's, there's some question that the other leaders at that meeting have to raise about whether they want him at the table when they're discussing their own security, and what risks that poses to directly communicate their most precious secrets to the Kremlin. So that's what was in my article. I felt that they needed to cover that issue.
Yes. So, thank you. In switching over regarding President Trump and what he has been saying vis-a-vis Israel and Iran, let's change over to this war that just literally started, I think, right after you and I last spoke. And one of the recordings we had, it wasn't even on the radar. I think I was running at the park on a Sunday evening. I forget which day it was. And all of a sudden, phones blowing up and social media is talking all about it. And there's been these, attacks from Israel, against nuclear scientists, top heads in Iran's military, as well as nuclear enrichment sites. So, can you catch us up, giving us the back to school approach when it comes to
Sure.
what's happened over the last week and a half, and what are we aware is going on right now?
The American approach to Iran has been twofold. One is threaten, that if they don't reach an agreement about nuclear arms, that is to say, Israel is threatened by Iran because if they have a nuclear weapon, that could be an existential threat to its existence. And because America supports Israel, they favor or they support Israel's contention that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. That's been ongoing, and so between threats of an invasion by Israel to knock out the nuclear sites that are being built, and an agreement that has been in place before, but Trump backed out of, and then started negotiating again with Iran, hoping to reach a new nuclear agreement where Iran would not venture into weaponry, but could use nuclear power for industrial purposes.
Mhm.
Uh, it appears from an inspection that was held by international monitors,
Yeah.
UN types, that despite what Iran was saying, they have actually been secretly building towards having nuclear weapons. And it seems that there are likely about 15 sites where they could have nuclear weapons. So that's just a no-no for Israel. So Israel ultimately decided, okay, we got to knock these sites out, and they started the war. And so almost almost instantly they knocked out, through a very clever ruse, I guess, they
Mm.
collected all the major leaders in the
Yeah.
nuclear area, including military leaders and scientists, like you mentioned, and they wiped them out. They were all in one building, and they blasted the building. And they now have achieved complete control over the skies of Iran
Yeah.
in terms of airplanes and stuff like that. And
So
they're
yeah.
bombing away.
Yeah. So I've been curious. A lot of people in the U.S., talk about that this was not necessary because Trump allegedly tore up the deal that was made previously between the Obama administration and Iran. Is that the case, or are we talking apples and oranges? I'm so a little confused about that. Now, I could go back in time and do the digging and the research and read up. And I know your focus has been, I think, more focused on European affairs,
Yeah.
and that this might be, me kind of
Oh,
putting you on the spot. But what's your take on that? Was there a deal that was in place that, if it had been followed and allowed to flourish up until 2016, when it was canceled by our side, that things would be very different now? Or do you think that President Trump had a point, that there was some shady dealings going on by the other side that has led us here, that the U.S. was justified in getting out of the deal? You might recall this, right? This was a big
I
deal in
do. I do.
2016,
Yeah.
2017.
Yeah. You've hit it right. Um, it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether that agreement would have held and whether we would have been in a safer world today had it held all the way through. So you have to kind of put your best guess out there. And my best guess was, if you've got an agreement and they're, trying to abide by it, maybe, inspections should have happened, and efforts should have been made to revigorate the agreement if there was failings. But to withdraw completely and allow the situation to deteriorate this way, well, we know what happened in
Yeah.
that, in
Yeah.
that road. So, but that's, lessons learned, and 2020 hindsight.
Correct.
At this moment, there's a war going on between Israel and Iran,
Yeah.
and people are dying in both countries. Iran does not have the capability to completely bombard Israel because of the Iron Dome that Israel has, and America's helping protect Israel to some degree. But some of the rockets are getting through. People have died, not to the extent, like I think there's 200 and maybe a little more than 200 people who have died in Iran. They're in the teens, I think, perhaps 20 or 2 dozen or so in
Yeah.
Israel. But the fact is, people are dying on both sides, and there's much more war to come, it appears.
Yeah. So, how should we look at this from a historical point of view? I know, based on your history and having covered global affairs for, well, I would say decades, right?
Yeah, yeah,
In my thinking, I hear people who are equating this, or the U.S.'s involvement, potential involvement, as being akin to, you know, WMDs in Iraq, justifying reasons why we should not go in to assist Israel because, hey, this is another ruse. We're going to get into a foreign entanglement we don't want to get ourselves into. But then on the other side, there's arguments where, well, this is more like World War II, that if people had listened and acted right and not appeased dictators, and make sure that you take out the bully, the people who are chanting death to you every day, is the way to go, so that we don't have a second, Holocaust, globally speaking, with nuclear weapons flying around. So what do you think, because there's a division here in the U.S. about
Yeah,
how we are to look at this current conflict? Is it like Iraq, or is it like Germany and Poland?
yeah. Well, I would say this. First of all, Israel um, has a right to defend itself, including waging war if it is being threatened, and including preemptive war, I suppose. Uh, but we should bear in mind Israel is a nuclear power. They don't admit it, but they probably have about, they say, from what I've read, 600 nuclear weapons, maybe many more, who knows. So um, the issue of, well, if Iran had a nuclear weapon, does that mean it's the end of Israel? I'm not sure. Like it could be, there could be an exchange of nuclear weapons, which could be the end of the world in a sense.
Mm.
Um, but it's something to bear in mind, I think, the fact that Israel's not, without nuclear weapons. Um, However, Iran is, the Rasputin of the world. They've been causing trouble all over the place, like Hamas, Hezbollah, uh, arming Putin with drones that they've made, for the war in Ukraine and so on. They're not exactly the most friendly nation in the world, and they don't have many allies. It seems that they are alone in this battle, and maybe there's a good reason why they're alone. And you know, the threat of nuclear arms, having nuclear arms in Iran, when the country is not really run by um, strong leaders. They're strong leaders, but they're not, shall we say, open-minded or open to discussions that could lead to a stronger sense of peace in the Middle East. So it's a toss-up. But in my case, and I also should bring in, not everybody's happy about what's been happening in Gaza. Like Israeli excesses in Gaza. I mean, there's no way. You have to say that shouldn't have happened. You can't have people dying of hunger in Gaza, especially children. That's just like, you can't do it. And the 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 capacity of Israel to knock out the leadership of the Hezbollah in the way that it did, and going into Lebanon to do it, to knock out Hamas, but in a like a catastrophic war in Gaza, and now their sense of being able to just go anywhere to knock out whoever's threatening them uh, gives people room to think like what's going on. And in our case, America's support seems broad enough. Like in the case of Gaza, it's troubling that America supported that. In my view, anyway, I'm not sure. I think many people have been very troubled by the Gaza war.
Yeah, I think that tens of thousands of people who have been killed,
Yeah,
especially when they're civilians, that's always been on top of people's minds.
yeah.
I think the other side is, well, Hamas is hiding, behind civilians. And to a point, I think that could have been justified in the very beginning. But then over time, it became less and less, of an argument people could stand behind. So,
Historically, forgive me.
yeah.
Historically, when the issue of weapons of mass
Mhm.
destruction were raised, and 9/11, post 9/11, we went to war. I think a key thing we didn't do was focus our efforts sufficiently enough on who was the enemy and the rest. And Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, I think in hindsight, it's always easy to say, but I think the key thing we should have done is focused our attention on that and bringing that to some kind of a conclusion. But then joining in the Taliban and getting into Afghanistan and Iraq war, and it just went. I think in hindsight,
Mhm.
fortunately, I can, in hindsight, I can say I think that it went overboard. The same thing may be happening here, especially with Gaza. The the notion of getting rid of Hamas and Hezbollah and even Iran and the nuclear issue is, probably a positive or at least a worthy cause, but you have to bear in mind it's expanding. Like we're going all over the Middle East with this war, and part of the equation is defining what it is exactly you're after. And they said they don't want regime change, although we would love regime change, to
Well,
tell
I'm
you
sure
the
that
truth.
many Persians would like regime
Yeah,
change.
right. So they're saying we're going after the nuclear arms, okay, and the missiles, because they're shooting missiles. So, okay, that's a military target. But then why are you hitting all these apartment buildings and everything? Like, we got to really get, focused on what it is that's okay and what's not okay in a war.
Yeah.
So that's the best I can give you on that subject.
Well, these topics are always complicated because they're not black and white. And
Yeah,
whenever you get on the topic of war, you're always going to, have a million and one, excuses to, get away with things that
yeah,
are pretty bad. But then be blamed if you don't take certain action to protect your own population. And so, me personally, I like to rise above, the noise and try to see things. I'm a big believer, obviously, in human nature, and understand that sometimes there are things that have to be done. At the same time, I think that the worst part of humanity is when we get into our tribalism and it becomes eye for an eye that never ends, right?
yeah,
Because how many people are we potentially creating in Gaza right now who are potentially going to be tomorrow's um, uh, terrorists, so to
yeah,
speak?
yeah,
People who would have gone through enough trauma to then justify, a whole new wave of revenge, killing. And so this just never ends.
yeah.
But let's flip over to, before we get to Ukraine, let's flip over to immigration in the U.S. So recently, as you've been following, there were a lot of noise between President Trump and Governor Gavin Newsom out in California. So ever since you and I had spoken about the Supreme Court basically greenlighting, some steps by the Trump administration to be able to, mass deport up to 250,000 people who actually did have status here. Um, Not that the Supreme Court agreed, but the Supreme Court permitted it based on some technicality in the lower courts or whatever. I think the administration has been very, very emboldened, and they've been taking some steps to be more aggressive and removing folks. It's been suggested that they were going after more criminal aliens. However, ICE, people showing up at Home Depot, for example, in LA, this sparked a lot of controversy and people left and right started going out to protest. And Trump sent the National Guards to prevent the protests from becoming riots. And there were some riots. I mean, you saw Apple stores being looted, for example. And so this turned into a giant circus, in my opinion, where, okay, both sides had some good points, but at the same time, it turned into this made for TV moment across our country. And then we had No King's Day follow that. This was on this past weekend, and coincidentally, the same time Trump was having the 250th Army parade in D.C. So all of this came to a head on immigration. Now it's completely off the news radar because we're back to Iran and Israel. But what was your take on all that had happened in such a very short period of time? And what's your assessment about where things stand immigration wise in the U.S.?
That so many people in so many cities came out to oppose what's been going on with immigration was warming for me. I thought, there's a note of sanity, and it was peaceful, largely. Okay, there was some, there were some skirmishes and so on, but largely peaceful, except for These days, you have to make some guy shot
I saw that
someone
somebody did
dead,
get killed in Utah.
so,
Yes.
yeah, which is horrible. But overall, amazingly, most of it was peaceful, and the people made the point. The point being, there are excesses here. This is not being done the way it should be. There's nobody that's opposed to deporting criminals. I have never met someone who wants to keep criminals here. But I read articles and letters. One evangelical leader wrote to Trump saying, "Hey, okay, we finally got it. The point is, we're going to go after the criminals, but let's give these people who've been here for 10, 15, 20 years a break. Let's sharpen the pencil here on what the focus is," which is a good sign in my view. And the fact that Trump has backed off on farm workers and hotel workers and restaurant workers is a good sign. It seems like we're making some progress in the immigration sphere in terms of figuring out what is and what is not appropriate and where we need to go. And I think that's a good sign. And people are waking up in terms of their views and paying attention to what's going on nationally. There's almost a revival taking place among people in the United States. One troubling statistic I read the other day, which is 60% of Americans can only read up to the 6th grade level. Oh my goodness. Like, we've got to focus on education, man. Like that's just not a possible scenario. I think that's a starting point.
Yeah.
We got to really hone in on education. We got to get people, reading for starters. But, I take heart in that it's like a pendulum. It's going back and
Yeah.
forth, but it seems like there's progress being made, and there's hope for America. you know? What can I say?
Yeah. Well, so switching over to Ukraine now.
Yeah,
Recently, Ukraine made, I guess they had their Trojan horse moment, right? They snuck in all these drones into Russia and trucks and Iran. I'm sorry. See, this is what happens when you start going all over the world.
yeah,
And so, recently, Ukraine snuck a whole lot of drones into Russia in trucks that then opened and they attacked all these different bombers, and the Russian, Air Force, taking a lot of them out. It didn't really do too much, I don't think, because Russia was still, throwing a salvo of, munitions over into Ukraine the very next day, to avenge itself. But it showed people that, again, Russia's not inevitable, right? And there's a lot of, it can die, by cuts, in 1,000 places, so to speak.
yeah,
There's a lot of weaknesses that it has, and you can only be an octopus that spread yourself out too wide without exposing yourself to too many risks. And could you imagine if Georgia rose up, or if one of these other, stands rose up? I think Putin could have just bitten off more than he could chew, so to speak, with when it came to attacking, Ukraine. But one of these weaknesses that they exposed was a vulnerability where Ukrainians were able to outmaneuver, bring in, covert ops, bring in spies, and bring in these drones to attack from inside Russia. That must put some fear in the Russian people, to think whether or not this is all worth it and whether or not they're safe. I think that was the message anyway that Ukraine was trying to send. But that hasn't really gone much, further than that from last I had heard. What's your takeaway from some of these points? It just seems to be escalating to me. Trump was supposed to be getting these, to the table. There was supposed to be the talk in Turkey. I think you and I spoke about this right before, on the eve of that last summit, and it never happened. Or I guess it did happen, but nothing came of it. I think the only thing I saw recently, they were exchanging dead bodies. Literally, there were 600 bodies being and prisoners being exchanged between the two sides. But that this war just seems never to be able to come to an end, and I blame Putin. But why? What's your takeaway from all of that?
Well, Zelensky today is in with the G7, so they're
Yeah,
talking about this, so it's timely. One thing that's happening is the way Putin is funding the war is through illegal sales of oil and gas, minerals and so on, but oil and gas in particular. So there are sanctions being applied by Western countries, but he's getting around the sanctions using older ships. And apparently, an example that I read about was oil is being shipped to Singapore and then transferred to Chinese ships that take it into China. So Russia's exporting to Singapore, and in the ports they transfer it to Chinese ships and take it into Russia. So there's an increasing effort by the G7, apparently being discussed, to clamp down on the sanctions. But a key statistic has been that Russia made 3 times more in the course of this war in oil sales than the amount that the entire Western based group that has been helping Ukraine has given to Ukraine to defend itself financially. So there's more work to be done in terms of applying the sanctions. But it's also true that Russia now has lost over 1 million soldiers invading Ukraine. 1 million. Those numbers exceed the numbers in World War II. They're getting up to the numbers of countries like the entire U.S. loss in World War II was a fraction of that. So it's significant. And Ukraine, of course, is losing also people. I don't know what the numbers are, but I imagine maybe 200,000-300,000. It seems like for every soldier Ukraine loses, they've said, like they're speculating they're up to 10 soldiers are lost on the Russian side. But these soldiers are not Russians from Moscow who drink coffee in the coffee shops of Moscow. They're from the Far East somewhere. You mentioned the stands and potential, some disruptions over there. There's some whisperings and some news from Kazakhstan that Kazakhstan has taken a step away from Russia and is sort of piping up about what's going on with the war in Ukraine. But it's early days. I don't know what will happen. The projection of some people who are experts on the economics of Russia, I heard projections that come July, August, Russia's economy could collapse. But who's to say? How do you know? There's projections. Putin has got some terrible illnesses and going to.
I heard that last year. Yeah.
Then on the other hand, you look at Trump. Sometimes you think, geez, he's 79. I mean, like, how does he looks a little pale sometimes. So who knows? But I would not say that the war is coming to an end very, very soon in terms of the fighting and Ukraine's capacity to resist. If you look, this war has been going on since 2014 when they invaded Crimea. So in that 11-year period, Russia has only been able to occupy somewhere around 20% of the land that is in Ukrainian land. And it's very important to understand 2 things. First one is Ukrainians are not fighting for land. They're fighting, for their existence as a nation, but also in the occupied territories, the choices are grim. Men are being castrated. Girls are being raped in front of their mothers and fathers. Uh, Children are being kidnapped and sent to Russia to become quote unquote Russians and be sent back as warriors. Like it's a disgusting, there's a genocide taking place back there. So, the idea, well, Ukraine will just throw their hands up and, surrender, go ahead, take us over. It's not it's not realistic for anybody who's in the war to say that. And the other thing is, I like to remind Americans that Ukraine was in every war that America had since Ukraine's independence in 1991. It sent soldiers helping Ukraine in every war. There's no country that has supplied more help to America, military help, than Ukraine, including rescuing people out of Afghanistan at a time when nobody else was prepared to risk their soldiers to get people out. They went in and got people out safely from Afghanistan. And there's a whole string of things that can be said about Ukraine's dedication for America or to America. And, there's this Budapest deal where, this is the last thing I'm going to say.
Yeah.
In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine ended up with the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, including strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, the third largest in the world, only behind Russia and the United States. I think that's the calculation, but the third largest. In 1994, President Clinton was anxious about why should Ukraine have nuclear weapons, and they held a meeting in Budapest, and they came to an agreement, and the agreement was, you, Ukraine, surrender all your nuclear weapons to Russia, and we, America, the UK, and France, China were also involved in there, and Russia, guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty. We will look after your sovereignty. In 2014, Russia, using the arms that were surrendered in part by Ukraine to Russia, invaded Ukraine in contravention of that Budapest agreement. But America owes Ukraine the protection that it ought to get. So if America is prepared to shoot down Iranian missiles over Israel to protect Israel, surely, given that agreement and what happened about nuclear war, like they lessened the chances of nuclear disaster, at least with regard to Ukraine, by surrendering the missiles, surely America could also do something similar in terms of the war in Ukraine. But it's going to be ongoing, and we'll be talking about it some
Yes.
time in the future again, probably.
Though a lot. And I was thinking, while you were talking, I'm like, well, Israel's not in NATO. And so that would then potentially bring in the other countries, and then you're going to have Article 5 issues.
Well,
but
that's true.
It's never black and white, right? In these conversations. But this is why we like talking about it, so we can flesh these things out.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people are thinking about these things. And sometimes when we discuss them, people, it might trigger something.
Good. We need to think about them. We need to come up with, forgive me for just launching in again. I hear of the attack Israel made on Iran, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the Middle East is going to go up in flames. I don't know what to do. And then I think, yeah, but Iran has, it's proven that Iran has not kept up to its commitments on nuclear disarmament. It's internationally proven. So what is Israel supposed to do? Lie down and, take it? They got to do something, so it's like you say, black and white is not the scenario.
Lots of issues. Okay, so this is a good point to wrap up all this roundup. We've gone a good How long have we been talking? About 40 minutes.
Wow.
We
Okay.
went from Israel, immigration, Ukraine, and thank you so much, Andy, for coming back and catching me up. And so hopefully this is educational for folks out there, and I will bring more back. And a lot of things are moving very, very quickly. And so I don't know where we're going to be in just 2 weeks from now, but we'll definitely have you back to catch us up. Okay.
Great. Nice
All
to
right.
be with you.
All right. Until next time, everybody, check out this video and others for education purposes on Lawyers Mediators International. All right. Take care.